So the Labour Party are planning to renationalise the railways in what they're calling the biggest overhaul of our railways in a generation.
The party's pledging to transfer rail networks to public ownership within 5 years if elected. And they say their plan will not cost the taxpayer a penny in compensation costs.
How can that be possible? Let us know what you think. We've been asking your thoughts about Labour's plans this morning.
I think it should be a standardisation, and you're not always sure of the fares.
Not sure now. It might be, but then can we afford it?
It can't get any worse.
Definitely should nationalise the railways and all the rest of the utility companies and the government. Can we do that?
Oh, she was spicy, wasn't she?
I love the British public. They always know what the problem is, don't they?
GB News political correspondent Katherine Forster joins us now with the latest. Katherine, we were saying many times this morning, it's easy to shout from the sidelines, as Labour are doing, about different policies, railways, defence and, whatever else. How are they going to implement this practically if and when they get into power?
Yes, good morning. Well, that is indeed the question. And we've had this 26-page, quite detailed document and a speech by the Shadow Transport Secretary, Louise Hay, this morning, outlining how Labour plans, if they come into government, as likely they will, basically to take back control of the railways, the passenger services, when the contracts end. Those contracts expire, the government will not renew them. That's how they can say that that's not going to cost a penny in compensation. They hope to do that by 2030. I think all but 2 of the contracts are up for tender by then. What we don't know, however, is what the costs will be going forward, in that they're saying they're going to not buy the rolling stock outright, but lease it. So that, of course, is going to run into many billions. But Labour's argument is fundamentally that privatisation of the railways hasn't worked. I'm just going to read you a quote. Unlike most privatisations, that of the railways has never been publicly accepted because its failings have remained all too obvious. Now, Louise Hay quoted that and then said, actually, that's the words of the current Defence Secretary, former Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps. They say, Labour says it's already costing taxpayers £4 billion a year to prop up the railways. Cost of strikes, £25 billion a day, says that fares have gone up twice as fast as wages. So they're saying that the railways are a symbol of national decline. They have big plans. Of course, some of the details specifically around money, not yet clear, but they're confident this is going to be popular. And I think we're seeing a return of boldness in politics over the last few days. This is a big announcement for the Labour Party. We've had loads of criticism of Labour and the Conservatives being really not much to pick between them. But, we had this big, bold announcement from the Prime Minister on Tuesday as well about 2.5% defence spending. The government have also got the Rwanda bill through Parliament. They made the big announcement on welfare reform. So over the last few days, we're suddenly seeing quite a lot of policies coming forward, both by Labour and the Conservatives, and the dividing lines for the next election suddenly becoming a whole lot clearer.
OK, thank you, Katherine Forster there. Now, let's discuss this further with former Labour advisor and associate editor of Labour Uncut, Kevin Meagher. Good morning, Kevin. Good morning. I think what Katherine says there is quite heartening, actually, because this idea that we're suddenly seeing water between the two parties and some bold policy ideas, I think the British public will be breathing a sigh of relief that they can start to see a difference between the two major parties. But on this issue of transport, do you think this privatisation has worked, and why will nationalising them provide a better service for us?
I think on pretty much any metric you look at, certainly the satisfaction of customers who use the railways, privatisation has been a disaster. It's been a disaster, really, because the numbers of people using the railways over the last 30 years have just grown exponentially. And our kit and our infrastructure just hasn't kept pace. I mean, it's a different issue, but this is partly what HS2 was about as well. And the trouble is that the train operating companies that are under licence operate the services don't cohere. There's no coordination effectively across a national network. So if you get a train, for example, that breaks down on a certain line and it's a certain company, in the olden days of British Rail, they weren't great, but under the old days of British Rail, it would have shunted it to the next station. They can't do that with different train operating companies, different liabilities, different insurance schemes and all the rest of it. So the big flaw in privatisation has been a lack of coordination, the breaking up of a network. And what Labour's saying today, effectively, is that there are two options. We either carry on with this absolute shambles, or we go a different way and have a greater state involvement. Now, they're keen not to say this is nationalisation. And I think it's fair to say this is not an ideological move. This is simply a case of the travelling public has just had enough.
But, Kevin, I'm no fan of these train operating companies. I paid something north of £90 this morning to get from just outside Brighton on the south coast to London. And, I was lucky to get that train. Normally it's cancelled or they skip my stop because they're running late. So, look, I'm no fan. However, isn't part of the problem our infrastructure, which is down to Network Rail? How would Labour sort out our absolutely crippled infrastructure problems?
I think you've got to start somewhere. I mean, the fact is that what we've got doesn't work. The status quo is not, in that sense, is not an option. And frankly, if I was advising the Conservative Party, I'd be saying you take a look at what Labour's doing and jump in ahead of them, because there's no other option here. Either the state takes a bigger role, a bigger controlling strategic role in the railways, or we carry on with inexorable decline. I mean, I had a conversation recently with a very middle class barrister in a pinstripe suit who's trying to get to Manchester. It was late for court, and the striking thing about the failure of the railways is that it affects everybody in society. It affects rich people, it affects students, it affects poor people, old people, young people, everybody, workers. And it's one of these issues that actually, when you start talking to people, as you often do, waiting for a late train, everybody comes up with basically the same solution, that we need to nationalise the railways, take greater control of them. So I think as a retail offer, in politics, this is actually a pretty smart move by Labour. And as I say, if the Conservatives were smart, they would have jumped in ahead of it and said it's just not tenable. Because MPs as well, for example, that they sense this firsthand as well, moving around the country. And it's one of these rare issues where MPs actually are in the same lot as pretty much all the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And I think there's been a kind of groundswell of opinion, particularly in the Labour Party, but way beyond it, that actually the only other option, if we don't carry on with this absolute disaster, is to renationalise the railways in all but name, but certainly have that more strategic central control from the government.
There will be people, of course, listening to this, Kevin, who are just going, oh, this is going to be more Labour spending loads of money. We're all going to be paying for these new trains and new services via our tax payments. How can Labour reassure the public that isn't what this is going to look like? It can't be beyond the wit of man to also make this somehow profitable.
Absolutely. I mean, as I say, the number of passengers that we've seen grow from the mid-1990s has grown about 40%. So there's got to be a model in here somewhere that actually makes money. And we seem to have had a sort of extraordinary situation where the state is propping up these private companies and has been all the way through privatisation. I think £4 or £5 billion a year, every single year, just to kind of keep the things going. So what we've got just doesn't work. And I think the only other option, as I say, is to take the government to take a bigger commanding role. And what happens, of course, is that the train operating companies operate under licence, and as those licences expire, what Labour's saying is it won't renew them and it will take state control of them, which we've seen even under this government with several lines already over the last 10 years or so. It's not, in that sense, it's not a lurch into the unknown. It's an extension, frankly, of what this government's already been doing, which is, as I say, if they were smart, they would have jumped in ahead of Labour on this one.
OK. Right. Kevin Meagher, Associate Editor of Labour Uncut, thanks very much.